At our High Mass today, we will have the First Holy Communion of our school children, our second graders in CCD. And I was reminded yesterday as we were having a rehearsal for First Communion, people often say, well, Father, you should tell this to everybody. So we'll have a little bit of our preparation for First Holy Communion today, and you can recall that wonderful day of your youth. I still remember my own First Holy Communion. It was at St. Cecilia's in Beaverton, and I remember we were, if you know St. Cecilia's in Beaverton, there's the main part of the church, and then there's the annex, and the people there at St. Cecilia's call that annex the one true church because on that side they look at a crucifix, and on the main part, they look at this resurrectifix. And so the people who sit looking at the crucifix consider themselves to be the one true church. And those who sit in the main part of the nave, well, I don't know. I think it's just sort of one of those, competition parish oddities. Anyway, we were sitting in the annex. But I think during those days, it wasn't necessarily as it is now. I just remember that it was a wonderful day, and I was very excited and just had this great sense of pride about my family and, being there with my brother and my two sisters, and it's a wonderful memory. I think maybe hopefully we all remember that day of our own First Holy Communion, how special it was. It's certainly a rite of passage for a young boy or a young girl. And so as we were preparing for this yesterday, we had a little rehearsal, and I was reminding the children that the communion rail is the table, and this is the altar. That's the altar, and that's the table. Now the table has a tablecloth on it, and so when it's time to eat, we put the tablecloth over the table. And that you never put your elbows on the table. That's one of those things we learn as a matter of etiquette when we're growing up. You don't put your elbows on the table. So you don't put your elbows on the communion rail. You place your hands underneath the cloth, and you can either hold it up like a bib so that if the host drops, it'll drop on the cloth instead of somewhere else. We also hold the paten under your chin so that if the host would drop, it would drop onto the paten, and if it misses the paten, it drops onto the cloth. And so we have that double measure of security there. Now, the reason why we hold the paten under your chin is something that we learn from the sequence of this Mass, that every particle is Christ whole and entire. So regardless of the fact that we divide the host into many, many pieces, it's already divided when we start, but Christ is never divided. Christ is always whole and entire in every single host, but in every single particle. And it's notable that we hold that paten under your chin. And even if a host doesn't drop, I'm just taking it from the ciborium right to your mouth. And even if a host doesn't drop, it's not uncommon that we'll have a few particles on that paten by the end of communion. Now that should really make us think, well, if we didn't have that paten, and if we didn't have you holding on to that cloth, where would that particle go? Well, it would go onto the ground. Maybe it'd be swept up because we didn't know it was there. Or maybe it'd be caught up into the vacuum cleaner because we didn't know it was there. And then where does that go? Well, that would go in the garbage. And that particle is Christ whole and entire in the smallest of particles. And that should really make us think about how precious the Eucharist is, even the smallest of particles. And this is why we have to guard against being lukewarm about the Holy Eucharist and about our reception of it. We have to guard against that because that can be a temptation, but it can also become just a habit, because as Catholics, we're just so used to being around holy things. And if you grow up Catholic, you're around holy things all the time. You just get used to them. You forget you forget that something is holy, or you forget how wonderful something is, or how amazing something is that's holy, because you're just so used to it. So we have to go back to our first Holy Communion and how special that was. Just as a priest has to go back to that first Mass that he ever celebrated and remember how amazing that was, to take that host into his hands for the very first time and say, Hoc est enim corpus meum. And I remember the first time I said that. I couldn't get through the words. Hoc est enim corpus meum. It was so hard to get through those words the very first time. What an amazing thing that was. And we should never forget that. A few years ago, during COVID, one of our parishioners gave me this framed needlepoint sign that says, Priests of God, remember, what does it say? Celebrate this Mass as though it were your first Mass, as though it were your last Mass, as though it were your only Mass. And we should think about that when we receive Holy Communion. Receive this Holy Communion as though it was your first Holy Communion. But what if you knew that it was your last Holy Communion ever? What if you knew that ahead of time? How would you receive that? And what if you knew that it was to be your only Holy Communion ever? How would you receive that? Well, it really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? I'm also going to read to you the gospel that you would have had today, because Corpus Christi used to be an octave, so that the Mass of Corpus Christi would be celebrated every day, but on the Sunday there was a special gospel that is complementary, but actually predates the Feast of Corpus Christi, which was instituted in the year 1264. But prior to that, this was a Eucharistic Sunday. And let's take a look at what that gospel has to say. At that time, Jesus spoke to the Pharisees this parable. A certain man gave a great supper, and he invited many. And he sent his servant at supper time to tell those invited to come, for everything is now ready. And they all with one accord began to excuse themselves. The first said to him, I have bought a farm, and I must go out and see it. I pray you hold me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am on my way to try them. I pray you hold me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. And the servant returned and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house was angry and said to his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. And the servant said, Sir, your order has been carried out, and there is still room. Then the master said to the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges and make them come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you that none of those who were invited shall taste of my supper. And thus far the words of the Holy Gospel. Now that should make us think too of how empty all of our Catholic churches are today. I know I mention this quite often, but it is a matter of concern, because if people knew what they were missing, they would not be missing what they are missing. Our churches are empty. And yet the Lord has invited, He has prepared a great banquet, a great supper, a great Mass. And this is for all peoples of every nation and language, every race. And yet our churches are empty. And there is even a popular movement among some people these days that they refuse to go to daily Mass, and even that some people get in trouble for going to daily Mass by other Catholics who tell them they shouldn't be going to daily Mass, or at least they shouldn't be going to this parish, or they shouldn't be going to that parish, even though their own parish doesn't offer daily Mass. And even so, they have to wait until their parish might someday offer daily Mass, but meanwhile they're not allowed to go to daily Mass anywhere else. And that is not right. It should be the norm for Catholics to go to daily Mass, and to strive to go to daily Mass as often as possible, especially on big feasts. And I mention that because Corpus Christi Thursday was a glorious day. And we didn't even have this many people. And we don't have that many people at this Mass right now. We didn't even have this many people with a full choir and just a few servers. And we had a beautiful procession through the neighborhood. And it was so sparse. Now, Corpus Christi used to be a holy day of obligation. And it is no longer a holy day of obligation. But does it take a day of obligation to get people to go to Mass for a big feast? I do know there are some parishes that get 100 people for daily Mass every single day, and other parishes that just get a few. But we certainly should not be listening to those who would tell us that we're not allowed to go to daily Mass. We certainly should not be listening to those voices. Those are not good voices. I want to encourage you to go to daily Mass as often as you can. I realize that that may not be here. You may not be able to come here, because I know many of you drive from long distances. But you should make an effort to go to daily Mass as often as you can, and especially on these big feasts. June is full of lots of big feasts. As an incentive, this next Friday is the Feast of the Sacred Heart, and there is a plenary indulgence offered for those who would pray the act of reparation of the Sacred Heart in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, which we will do after both Masses on Friday. I want to encourage you not only to go to daily Mass, but especially to go to Mass on these big solemnities. They're not holy days of obligation. You haven't committed a sin by not going. But really, it should be the norm for Catholics, especially devout and pious Catholics, to be at Mass as often as you can. And if you can't go to Mass every day, make a visit to the Blessed Sacrament as often as you can, outside of Mass. Stop in and say hello to the Lord. And if the church door is locked, then go ring the doorbell of the parish office, and we'll open up for you. Let us remember that first Holy Communion we took. Let us receive Holy Communion today with a profound sense of adoration and thanksgiving and awe, as though it were our first Holy Communion. And if it were our last, how would we receive it? And if it were the only time we would ever receive it, let us receive it in that way today. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.